Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's December 22nd, 2021. And Helga, as we've been reporting over the recent weeks, the drumbeat for war continues coming from the transatlantic powers. The Russians are making proposals to try and address it. They seem to be getting little or no response from the West. What's the latest that you have on this?
Well, it is extremely worrisome because, it seems that there are people committed to, make a brinkmanship. Obviously, they hope that Russia and China, for that matter, will back down. But, I don't think that that's in the card. So, last week, I think we spoke, or 2 weeks ago, we spoke about this unbelievable statement by Senator Vicker that he doesn't want to take the first use of nuclear weapons off the table. Now, in the meantime, this whole thing has escalated. There was a CNN report with an unnamed US high ranking official. The suspicion is that it was National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who basically said that we only have a window of 4 weeks left until we have to get a breakthrough, and somehow, referring to a possible plan of Russia to invade Ukraine, which Russia has denied many times emphatically. But it looks, if you look at the chronology of the last several weeks, it started probably much earlier, but let's take the visit of the Director of National Intelligence of the United States, Avril Haines, to Brussels, where she briefed the NATO ambassadors about so-called hard evidence intelligence that Russia would plan an invasion of Ukraine at the beginning of 2020. Now, as I said, this was denied by Russia. Then, there are obviously troops being gathered at the Russian side of the Ukrainian border, which has been commented many times by Russia that it's their good right to do on their territory whatever they want. According to Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman from the Russian Foreign Ministry, there are at least 10,000 troops from NATO in Ukraine, 4,000 from the US and 6,000 from other countries. And, in the middle of all of that, Putin, there was this discussion between Putin and Biden on Zoom or some virtual discussion about a little bit more than 2 weeks ago, which again looked as if this would move forward, but then immediately the people around Biden went back to their bellicose statement. So one never knows exactly what is the U.S. Policy exactly. And then basically Putin proposed 2 treaties to NATO. Now, these are not proposals for negotiations, but ready-made treaties. One for the United States to sign that they will basically not insist that Ukraine be in NATO, and the other one for NATO to sign that NATO will not move anymore eastward. Now, the Russians, Putin, they said that that this is not negotiable. This pertains to the very national security interest of Russia, and they insist that these treaties be signed. Now, the reaction from the West, from Stoltenberg, from Lambrecht, the new defense minister from Germany, and various other people, they said they will not dictate Russia what to do, and so forth. But there was no serious response so far. And various Russian spokesmen, Ryabkov's deputy foreign minister, Grushkov, and various other people, Lavrov also, they all said that, this is very serious if there is no response from the West, and if there is any more move either weapons into Ukraine or to expand NATO in any way more eastward, there will be a military answer coming from Russia. And that the bottom line has been reached, the red line has been reached. So we are sort of in a countdown, where it's very clear that whoever is pulling the strings in NATO in the end, and sometimes one is not quite clear if it's Biden or not, or rather not. They're obviously said that this policy of encirclement against Russia and China continue, and Russia has said the red line has been reached. Now, this is very, very dangerous because, then one of the, I think it was also Sullivan, said that, that if there is any move from Russia in respect to Ukraine, that they will punish the economy of Russia so terribly that it, anyway. So there are all these threats in the air. And there is now a very interesting statement by Leonidas Christantopoulos, the former Greek ambassador, who commented on all of that by basically saying that the West should not be so hypocritical. I mean, I'm now using these words my own, but that the West should recognize that all Russia is demanding in written legal terms is what was promised in 1990 to them by the United States, by NATO, in the negotiations concerning the German unification. And this is actually a matter of record. There are now documents which everybody can look up, that on the 9th of February in 1990, Baker, Foreign Minister, Secretary of State Baker from the United States, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And this was also the content of the famous speech by then Foreign Minister Genscher in his speech in Tutzing, where he basically said the same thing. Naturally, everybody knows these promises, which unfortunately were not made in written form, but just verbally, they were broken almost immediately, and altogether 14 countries of the former Soviet Union were integrated into NATO. And, recently and many times earlier, Russia has made the point that to have Ukraine and Georgia in NATO is unacceptable for the very simple reason that if you look at the border between Ukraine and Russia, it leaves only a few minutes, maybe as little as 5 minutes, until any weapon systems would reach Moscow, which obviously is much too short a time to have an effective defense. So Russia makes the point that its national security interest is absolutely threatened by these moves by NATO, and so we are on a countdown. And we should just keep in mind, if it comes to any war in between Russia and Ukraine, which would involve any kind of even without Western involvement, and this would escalate, Germany would immediately be the target. And if you have such statements like that of Senator Wicker, that the first use of nuclear weapons cannot be taken off the table, people should be aware of the fact that if it comes to this, Germany ceases to exist. So, this is what I have been, one of the reasons why I have been saying that NATO is no longer a security pact which is in the self-interest of Germany, because if in the case of any military conflict, Germany ceases to exist, obviously this is not a good defense strategy. So I think, first of all, people must make themselves familiar with this danger. According to the reports, we are in a 4 weeks countdown, and I think it is the absolute urgent necessity that NATO and the United States and European countries do agree to sign such legally binding agreements with Russia, even if Putin, in a just conducted meeting with some of his top military people, said that even a legally binding signed document does not give full security, because the United States has now a very long record that they pull out of treaties without any problem overnight. But, I mean, there must be a recognition that we are on a terribly dangerous road, and people must voice their opposition against this policy loud and clearly before it is too late.
And there have been some voices speaking out in the West, but not nearly enough. And then instead, they're drowned out by people like Sullivan, who said Russia must reciprocate, Russia must de escalate when the escalation is coming from the West. And the US has not even responded yet to this request for these treaties to be negotiated. Now, unless you have something more on that, I think we need to move on to the situation in Afghanistan, where there have been some developments with the OIC meeting over the weekend, a potential for possible motion on unfreezing the funds. I think 46 congressmen have written a letter to Biden. What's your sense of is there some momentum building on this, especially given the reports of the danger to millions of people, including children, of starvation and freezing this winter?
Yeah, I mean, this is the second absolutely, in a certain sense, heartbreaking and extremely upsetting story. The West talks about moral values, value-based order, human rights, democracy, all of these beautiful words, but the reality is quite ugly, because, I mean, the World Food Program had representatives, I think Beasley and the responsible person for Afghanistan, visiting Kabul and Kandahar in the last several days, and they come back and say basically that 98% of the Afghanistan population is practically in dire poverty. More than 90% are food insecure, without medical supply. 24 million people are in danger of dying this winter. 3 million children, babies are dying already. And, I mean, this is the 21st century, and the whole world should know about it. But if you look at the Western media, after the Taliban took over in August, there was a short period where Afghanistan was in the news, but since several months, you hardly hear anything about it. Now, there was a very important conference over Friday, Saturday, Sunday in Islamabad, in Pakistan, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. This is with 57 states, the second largest international organization after the United Nations. And they had a meeting which was addressed by the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan. And I listened to his speech, and I was, really, not that everything was new what he said, but he said it very distinct. He said, when the Taliban took over and the West withdrew, everybody knew that 75% of the budget of Afghanistan came from international aid. And since that aid was immediately cut, the donor countries cut that aid right away because the Taliban had taken over, everybody knew that the entire budget of Afghanistan was all of a sudden practically non-extinct. Then you had the freezing of the funds by the Treasury, by European banks. So there was a complete cash crisis. The people could not import anything, they could not pay salaries. The whole thing broke down, and this is going on since 4 months with the result I just mentioned before. But, this is not the Taliban. When you hear the Western media, if they report anything at all, they say, oh, yeah, the economy is now terrible because of the Taliban. It is not because of the Taliban, because if you have, after 20 years of NATO war, NATO leaves and the United States forces leave in a sudden fashion a country in which they conducted for 20 years a war. They leave the country, nothing has been built, no economy, no infrastructure, nothing is functioning. And, then they cut off the international lifeline, namely the donor monies, which consist, which, make up 75% of the Afghanistan budget. They cut this off, they freeze the funds, and then naturally a catastrophe erupts, which nobody, not the Taliban nor anybody else, can handle, because you de facto have sanctions and you have a complete freeze of everything, and the West knows that, and they not react. I mean, this is unbelievable. I find, if you look at the Afghanistan situation, this is the end of any credibility of the West. And, just to think that because the Western media are not reporting that, people should not think that this goes unnoticed. For example, the 57 OIC nations notice, all the neighbors of Afghanistan notice, all the third world notice. So I think that if this is not reversed very, very quickly, this will be of a lasting impact of the demise of the West. This is why I have said that the fate of Afghanistan and the fate of humanity are much closer linked than most people are willing to think through. So, I find this absolutely horrendous. So what the OIC conference decided, they will set up a fund. I don't know exactly the amounts, which will be made available, but they will set up an office in Kabul, and the OIC offered to coordinate international aid. So something is being done for sure. But the problem is so gigantic that it really requires all the neighbors of the West, of Afghanistan, to cooperate. And I think that the United States and the European countries, they were for 20 years in this country, and then they walk away. This is from the standpoint of international law completely unacceptable. So Europe and the United States have an absolute moral obligation to reverse that and cooperate with the neighbors of Afghanistan, and not only have an immediate humanitarian aid to alleviate the hunger, the lack of medical supplies, but then participate in the economic buildup of the country, which can only occur by integrating Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative projects, the CPEC corridor from Pakistan to Kabul to Uzbekistan, the building of the cyber pass, and other well-defined projects which would immediately start building up the economy. So that is, what needs to be done. And, there are 38 congressmen who made an appeal to Biden to unfreeze the funds which are held by the Treasury. I think this is important. And, obviously this must immediately happen because the winter is already there.
And toward that end of accelerated humanitarian aid, you made the proposal, which you call Operation Ibn Sina, that actually is, while specific to Afghanistan, actually reflects the need for the whole world in the midst of the COVID crisis, the economic breakdown, which is the necessity for a world health system as the front end of a massive infrastructure investment program, which could include the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. How does that look as a prospect from your standpoint right now?
Well, I think Operation Ibn Sina, because one has to start with Afghanistan, and Ibn Sina comes from, probably a place nearby Bukhara, which is Uzbekistan, but his father was born in Balkh, which is Afghanistan, and people are very proud of him. He's probably the greatest doctor ever lived. So there is no better name to give this effort to build a modern health system in Afghanistan than to call it after Ibn Sina. And there has already been great interest in this idea coming from several places in the region. But more largely, I mean, we have now a new wave of the COVID-19, the Omicron mutation. And, people are, I mean, again, there is such an unwillingness by the establishments of the Western system to recognize that we have been on the wrong track. And I said in the very beginning, when it was clear that this was a pandemic in March 2020, I said, we need a world health system, or else this pandemic will not go away. Then we had all these different mutations, and now we have Omicron, and there's no guarantee that there are not going to be new mutations. And it's also clear that the idea that the rich countries are producing and hoarding vaccines and leave the third world is not helping anybody, because if you leave entire continents without vaccinations and without modern health equipment, then this virus will mutate as it has done now, and it will come back, and eventually, it may even make the existing vaccines obsolete. So, either we go in earnest and say that the fact that billions of people do not have modern hospitals is unacceptable, don't have clean water, don't have enough electricity. I mean, this is something which could be done. There is no reason why we could not immediately start to build modern infrastructure like we have it in Germany. It may be rotting, but it's still there because previous generations were a little bit more smart than the present crop of politicians. But there is no reason in the world why not technologically, we could not start building hospitals. We need about 30,000 new hospitals around the world. That it would be easy. We could even, make these hospitals, prefabricate them in the United States, in Europe, and then ship the models to the respective countries. The Chinese have proven in Wuhan that you can build a modern hospital in 2 weeks. This could be done this way. We could start a crash training program for medical personnel. I have called for the, youth, young people from the world to be trained to help building such an effort, like it was done by Franklin D. Roosevelt with the CCC program in the New Deal. You can train young people on the job, give them a vision and a mission in life. And I think this is really something, we cannot continue this way. I mean, the idea that every time something happens, the rich countries only take care of themselves and the developing countries are left in the dark, that has to stop. And we have to start to really think in terms of a new paradigm if humanity is supposed to come out of this crisis. And, given the fact that we have now the Christmas period, the holiday season, people have some days of time to think, and rather than just, going about your business as usual. I mean, this is a breaking point of civilization. Either we really can shape up as a human species, or it may not look so great for our perspective.
And I think your last point, that in the spirit of Christmas, of generosity and love of mankind, peace and goodwill towards men, this would be the time to move ahead with the shift to the new paradigm. Helga, thanks for joining us today. And I know you wish all your viewers a Merry Christmas, as do I. And we'll see you again next week.
Yes, I wish you a Merry Christmas. And, the first topic we discussed, I really want you to think about, because, what we face in Europe between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe and NATO is like a reversed Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy, pointed to the fact that, an island which is only 160 miles away from the coast of Florida, the idea that you could deploy nuclear missiles in such a close vicinity obviously could not be tolerated. But, nuclear missiles in NATO, in the Baltic, the missile defense system in Poland, in Romania, then the idea to move lethal weapons into Ukraine. I mean, from the standpoint of the Russians, this is exactly like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I really want you to use this Christmas period to really work with the Schiller Institute and help us to stop something which could really be fatal for all of humanity. And at the same time, there are all the resources, there are so beautiful contributions of civilization, Beethoven's music, all the great poets, the great philosophers. Read these things over these days and rethink how we should go about it, because we definitely need to change course urgently.